Join us as EWTN goes on location to Steubenville, Ohio, on the Franciscan University's Christian Philosophy Conference, Must Morality Be Grounded in God? Today, Peter Colosi presents his talk entitled Ratzinger, Habermas, and Pera on public reason and religion.
There are two kinds of atheists out there now. One, the atheists who think religion is the cause of all evil in the world and who strive to eradicate it in order to bring about their version of utopia. And two, the atheists who perceive that the world is going terribly off track and wonder whether religion, after all, does have something to offer with respect to how we structure our common life together. This paper is about the conversation happening between that second type of atheist and people of faith. Recently, Josef Ratzinger has collaborated on book projects with Jürgen Habermas, an atheist, and Marcello Pera, an agnostic, on questions pertaining to the foundations of morality and the common good. Habermas, who once held a Rawlsian view with respect to religious voices in the public sphere, has changed his position, stating, quote, "The liberal state has an interest in its own of unleashing religious voices in the public sphere, for it cannot know whether secular society would not otherwise cut itself off from key resources for the creation of meaning and identity," end quote. Marcello Pera has expressed a very similar position to be discussed below. This new openness of some high-profile atheists and agnostics to religious voices in the public sphere, combined with the West's rejection of its moral heritage and historical roots, has led Josef Ratzinger to the following suggestion, quote, "In the age of the Enlightenment, the attempt was made to understand and define the essential norms of morality by saying that these would be valid et si Deus non daretur, even if God did not exist. We must reverse the axiom of the Enlightenment and say, even one who does not succeed in finding the path to accepting the existence of God ought nevertheless to try and live and direct his life valuti si Deus daretur, as if God did indeed exist," end Ratzinger. That et si Deus non daretur can be explained as follows. Immanuel Kant in his time was deeply concerned about the loss of morality that would ensue from his position on the unknowability of God's existence, free will, and the immortality of the soul. Thus, Kant decided to accept as postulates of practical reason God's existence, free will, and the immortality of the soul, in order that morality would not fall apart, which he thought would inevitably happen if people actually rejected God, free will, and immortality when they build their ethics. Marcello Pera expresses this by saying that Kant and also Galileo were trying to keep what is, and can be verified scientifically, together with what ought to be, which is based on customs, faith, and belief. Kant and Galileo wanted to promote traditional morality even if God did not exist or could not be known. Pera concludes, quote, "The solution thought out by Kant did not succeed, because once it had taken hold, the logic of separation of science and morality and faith was more powerful than the logic of unification." Ratzinger remarks that the separation which ensued indicates that our moral strength has not grown in tandem with the developments of science. On the contrary, it has diminished. And this results in the growing influence, Ratzinger says, that power and profit inflict on us. Ratzinger's approach is reminiscent of a line from John Paul's first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, in which he says, "The man of today lives increasingly in fear. He is afraid that what he produces can radically turn against himself. He is afraid that it can become the means and instrument for an unimaginable self-destruction, compared with which all cataclysms and catastrophes of history seem to fade away," end quote. That quotation leads one immediately to think of nuclear weapons. It can also recall the devastation inflicted by mankind on mankind by the totalitarian regimes of Europe in the last century, and it applies equally to developments in biomedical technology, and we could even say, I think, to capitalism as it's currently practiced. With respect to these threats in biotechnology, which have resulted from the exaltation of science divorced from morality and religion, Ratzinger stated to Habermas, which is why he says nature and God in this quote, "Man is now capable of making human beings, of producing them in test tubes. Man becomes a product, and this entails a total alteration of man's relation to his own self. He is no longer a gift of nature or the Creator. He is his own product. Man has descended into the very wellsprings of power, to the sources of his own existence. The temptation to construct the right man at long last, the temptation to experiment with human beings, the temptation to see them as rubbish, to be discarded. All this is no mere fantasy of moralists opposed to progress." End quote. It's actually happening. Motivated by these extreme fruits of the separation of science and reason from religion and morality, Ratzinger suggests reversing the axiom of the Enlightenment, asking that people of our day consider living as if God exists, even though they do not believe in him. Why is this a reversal of the axiom? What is the meaning of the shift from living according to traditional morality, even if there is no God, to the idea of living life in such a way that you imagine God exists and then live according to that? Is there even a difference between those two? There is a difference, and it is noted in a change in the cultural backdrop from the 18th to the 21st century. It fits with something what you said. The reason why it was possible for the people of the 18th century to agree on the basics, if you will, was because, Ratzinger says, the great fundamental convictions created by Christianity were largely resistant to attack and seemed undeniable. But, he continues, that is no longer the case. Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor wrote a major work, which won the Templeton Prize, called A Secular Age. If I understand Taylor correctly, he does not mean by secular age that everyone in our day is living debauched lives. Whether that is the case or not, his definition of a secular age is something different. He means that in times past, there was a cultural backdrop against which everyone in the society made decisions. That backdrop in the West was Christianity, and so if a European left her faith, she knew exactly what she was departing from. This does not mean that there was a golden age when everyone was living virtuous lives. It just refers to that Christian backdrop of society, which sort of imbued European life and culture with a specific ethos of which everyone was aware. Taylor means that our age is secular because that backdrop is no longer. Christianity is just one option among a number of other options, which one may select equally as one's life's philosophy. If you talk to young people today, for example, high school students who did not grow up going to church and watch the popular TV shows, you immediately realize that they do not have a foundational knowledge of Christianity, and that Taylor is right. Whereas if you talk to an older person who left their faith, you have something in common. They reject it, but you both understand what they are rejecting. There's no need to do the foundational catechetical work for the common ground basis of a conversation about accepting or rejecting church teaching. So the people of the 18th century, they had sort of a co-natural knowledge of traditional morality because for centuries the cultural backdrop that colored their world was Judeo-Christian or Greco-Judeo-Christian. Kant was able to suggest the postulates of practical reason because he lived in that setting. Now, this, to quote Ratzinger, reassuring certainty of something that could go unchallenged is not part of the cultural mindset of contemporary Europeans or Americans. So Ratzinger's meaning of reversing the axiom becomes clear. He's asking people of today to consider living according to a set of principles with which they are unfamiliar, but which offer relief from the malaise engulfing them. People in the 18th century, on the other hand, seeing the multiplication of Christian denominations and doubting God, they didn't want to lose those basics of morality that they all agreed upon. Marcello Pera responded that Ratzinger's proposal should be accepted. And Habermas holds this view. Here's another one of Habermas's quotes from his Holberg lecture. He says, "The force of religious traditions to articulate moral intuitions with regard to social forms of a dignified life, human life, makes religious presentations on relevant political issues a serious candidate for possible truth claims." And by the way, John Rawls himself adjusted his view in this direction also in his well-known article, The Idea of Public Reason Revisited, when this is Rawls, quote, "Reasonable comprehensive doctrines, religious or non-religious, may be introduced in public discussion at any time, provided that in due course proper political reasons, and not reasons given solely by comprehensive doctrines, are presented that are sufficient to support whatever the comprehensive doctrines are said to support," end quote. It must be pointed out, though, that Rawls did not go as far as Habermas. Habermas claimed that this demand to translate represents an unfair asymmetrical burden required of religious citizens but not of secular citizens. While Habermas does hold the view that if religious sources are employed when enacting legislation, then translation would be needed in crafting actual laws, he nonetheless calls for what he calls a balanced distribution of cognitive burdens. When he asks, Habermas asks secular citizens to give up their presupposition that religious traditions are nothing more than archaic relics of pre-modern societies, and to respect them as equal voices, even when they present their arguments in religious terms. Habermas holds that view now. And he thinks society can learn from it. At this point, a question emerges about the difference between Habermas and Para on the one hand and Ratzinger on the other. It is all well and good that some big-name atheists and agnostics are now welcoming people of faith back to the public discussion. How nice of them. But what of this idea, and you sort of asked this question, what of this idea of building a society on the scaffolding of Catholic social and moral teaching without anyone in that society actually believing the faith? Could that work? It seems to me that Para thinks this is not only possible but necessary to save Western society. In what sense does Ratzinger's view accept this notion, and in what sense does it not? In order to grasp that, we must understand what Ratzinger means by faith. First, note that faith is often used in two senses. One, by faith we mean the teachings of the church. This can mean matters of revelation, but also the precise moral indications given by the church. And then the second meaning of faith, we mean the lived relationship between a person and God, which includes also prayer and participation in the sacraments. So the distinction between the teachings of the faith and a living faith is what I mean. Now, in recent public discussions, I have noticed, and you probably all have too, that those who disagree with Catholic positions have a premise in their arguments that faith is by nature irrational. As far as I can discern, they mean that both aspects of faith listed above are irrational. For example, if the Catholic faith teaches that marriage is between one man and one woman, or that contraception is immoral, these are said to be irrational in the sense that they violate equality or choice, which are considered rational. With respect to the second meaning of faith, living faith, that is said to be irrational in the sense that those who say they have a relationship with God are imagining it or producing it because of some psychological disturbance, or they're afraid of death or some such thing. In discourse in the public sphere on matters of public policy, one task that Catholics are called to is to show the reasonableness of our teachings and their ability to contribute to the common good. This is very important to do, and people like Habermas and Para and others are now open to listening. But those people see no need for or connection to faith in the second sense, a living faith. I think Para believes that you can build a society on the scaffolding of Christian and social moral principles, even if no one in that society has faith. He thinks it's necessary, actually. Ratzinger sees an important connection between the teachings being in society and a lived faith. But the connection that Ratzinger sees is not that all non-believers must believe before the common good can be achieved based on true morality. So in order to understand the precise nature of the connection that Ratzinger is going to suggest, we have to say what he means by faith in this second sense, living faith. He begins by making a distinction between natural faith and supernatural faith. He then says that what they have in common is the same three-step structure: knowledge, trust, verification. Where they differ is in step one, knowledge. Examples given by Ratzinger of natural faith are electricity and pharmacy. There are some people who know how to harness and direct electricity, and there are also some people who know how to create drugs that can cure our various ailments. Most of the rest of us do not know how to do those things, and so we trust the small number of people who do. This trust in their knowledge is an act of natural faith. There are two reasons why this natural faith is not irrational. First, we can verify it by flicking on a light switch or taking the medicine. And secondly, the knowledge is obtainable by anyone who has the gumption to learn it. Just go get a degree in electrical engineering or pharmacy science. Compared to the entire population, though, only a few people gain that knowledge base. And there are many more examples of this. And so Ratzinger says, we live within a network of unknown quantities. There's a small number of people in whom a large number of people have a natural faith. And this is not irrational for the two reasons just given. Okay, now what does Ratzinger mean by supernatural faith? It has the same three-step process: knowledge, trust, verification. But the source of knowledge is different in kind than the source of knowledge in natural faith. Rather than learning about a field of study, the knowledge which is at the basis of supernatural faith comes from meeting a person. To take an example from Scripture, the Samaritan woman goes to the well at midday when no one else will be there, and she expects no one to be there. But someone is there. A conversation ensues between her and Jesus. You all know the content of the conversation, but the subplot is simple. Jesus says, "I am God." And she says, "Really?" And he says, "Really, I am. Let me tell you about you." She drops everything then, goes back to the town, and says to everyone, "You're not going to believe this, but I was just talking to God right over there." They notice something about her, something different, and likely combined with the fact that it is precisely this woman, they believe her. That is an act of faith. Then they set out for step 3, verification, after which they say to the poor woman, "We don't need you anymore. We met him ourselves now and believe." Ratzinger holds that with supernatural faith also, a large number of people gain living faith through a small number of people who have met God. How do we do that? In meeting a saint or a prophet. Ratzinger's definition of a prophet is not a seer of the future, but one who has met God and who has the task of sharing him with others. In meeting such a person, we acquire a living faith. The woman at the well, in this sense, is just like Moses when he comes down from the mountain, his face beaming with light. This lived faith mysteriously opens one's eyes to the dignity of persons and makes you look at others with a look of love, which he also discusses in this book with Para. This changes all of your behavior in a foundational way. Basically, you begin to live according to traditional Christian morality because you can see it properly now. This then is noticed by others, and they are drawn to you and to it. On the assumption, accepted by some high-profile atheist and agnostic thinkers, that Catholic and social moral teaching does have well-reasoned, common-sense principles to offer in the public sphere, principles they seem at times to be granting now are the best source of bringing about the common good, is it possible to employ those principles even if no one in the society has a living faith? Marcello Pera thinks the answer is yes and is calling for Europeans to do this before Europe is no longer. Josef Ratzinger's answer is yes, but. Ratzinger thinks that the teachings are accessible to reason, and therefore, like Pera, makes a plea for people to live as if God exists. Put simply, I take Ratzinger to mean something along these lines. Before it is too late, please try living according to the principles of Catholic social and moral teaching because it really is good for you and society, and if you try it, you will see. That's what Ratzinger's saying. However, unlike Pera, Ratzinger thinks that unless there is a critical mass of citizens who have a deep faith, prayer life, sacramental life, and live a fulfilled life according to the teachings, unless there's a critical mass of such people, Pera's proposal will fail. An interesting question on the theme of this conference emerges here. Is there a distinction between an implicit and an explicit foundation of morality on God? Let me explain that idea by asking 3 questions. 1, what is the role of Christian witness with respect to the knowledge of morality in the minds of non-believers? 2, what is the role of Christian witness in the formation of public policy when collaborating with non-believers? Of Christian witness, not just Christian teaching. And 3, is there a sense in which knowledge of Christian morality, or even just knowledge of the natural law, can only be known by the wider public if a critical mass of people actually live a fulfilled life according to it, because they understand it. It is certainly true that we cannot live according to traditional morality on our own. We can barely do it and often fail, even with the help of grace. But that desire to really try to live according to it, seems to come from meeting a saint or meeting God and the effect that has in your soul. And when non-believers encounter all of this in someone or in a large group of people, it can have two effects. It can open them to the possibility of living differently, even if they do not believe in God, or it can open them to a living faith. I think Ratzinger is saying that for true morality to even be known by the wider public, there is an epistemological sine qua non, namely, men and women who make God credible by their lives and by their happiness. The knowledge of morality for non-believers is rooted not in their faith in God, because they do not have that, but in seeing the lives of faithful Christians. This is an implicit or indirect source of real knowledge, real moral knowledge. I think Ratzinger holds that Christian witness can perform those two distinct roles, introduce people to new ways of living or bring them to a living faith. And in his book projects with Habermas and Pera, Ratzinger is focusing only on the first of these. He's respecting their lack of faith in God. And he is agreeing with their idea that Christian principles have something to offer in the public sphere. And he is also tapping into their awareness that the West is unraveling as the motive for their willingness to take a second look at religion. But Ratzinger is then calling on Christians to realize that if they want to reach the level even of convincing open-minded non-believers of basic social and moral principles, they have to be witnesses or it won't work. And the only way they can be witnesses is to rely on God and grace in the midst of their trying to be good.
EWTN returns to Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio, as Anthony Flood presents his talk on social contract theory and moral motivation.
I wanted to address the connection between social contract theory and moral motivation, and I realized as I was glancing through the paper a bit ago that one thing I don't make clear till the very end, and maybe I need to state that before I really jump into it, is, I think there is some positive value to social contract theory. I don't want to put this theory up there just to reject it. I think there's reasons for its viability. I think there's to a real extent reasons for its necessity in our culture. All right, but there's some deficiencies in terms of moral motivation that I want to focus on, and I think God and religion can remedy that. So that will become clear in the final section, that this is not just meant to be an all-out attack on social contract theory. All right. There are several possible connections between God and morality, including God as the goal of our moral acting, God as the metaphysical foundation of moral principles, and the role that God, and by extension religion, may play in the context of moral motivation. In this paper, I address this last connection and argue that societies that employ a social contract justification of government and social morality can survive long-term only if a majority of their populations are religious practitioners. More precisely, even if we grant for the sake of argument that a society can justify its laws on the naturalistic basis of rational self-interest, such rational self-interest is an insufficient source of motivation to comply with the law, at least in terms of society at large. By contrast, religion, particularly insofar as it affirms a transcendent reality or being to whom we are all responsible, does offer adequate motives for society's sustainability. As is probably obvious from the above formulation, I think that a variety of religions can in principle fulfill the motivational requirement. However, for the purposes of the context, I will cast my argument in terms of theism in general and Christianity in particular. I will proceed by first summarizing social contract theory with a particular focus on the role enlightened self-interest performs within it. The second section provides arguments that self-interest fails as an adequate source of motivation for the long-term viability of the state. And then lastly, I address the ways in which religion can offer motives sufficient for the promotion of a healthy state. All right, so to the first section. Modern social contract theory begins with Hobbes, who asks us to imagine human relations in the absence of governmental structures. This state of nature is a brutal environment in which the factors of human selfishness, human equality, and limited resources combine to produce a state of war of all against all. The grand irony of these circumstances is that each person's total freedom, or the freedom from any restriction whatsoever, leads to each person's inability to realize any of his self-interest goals. Consequently, the denizens of the state of nature agree to a social contract where each person sacrifices some of his freedom, particularly the freedom to kill and steal, etc., in exchange for the same sacrifice on the part of everybody else. The state, or the Leviathan, in turn, is created with the near absolute power in order to enforce this agreement. In sum, while it is within the self-interest of each person to agree to the contract so that his long-term self-interest goals may be better achieved. Hobbes is quite clear that self-interest constitutes the baseline motive through each of these phases. Each of us should obey the law of the state because it is in our self-interest to do so. If we are ever tempted to break the social contract, the absolute power of the state should deter us. Turning to John Locke, and ultimately I'm doing this for the sake of setting up John Rawls. That's the real person I want to focus on here. Locke softens some of Hobbes' harsher elements, but endorses a similar social contract account, maintaining that a self-interested basis of government is still the way to go, but there are some moral elements even in the state of nature. But there will be enough people in the state of nature who basically try to take your property, who don't respect the natural rights, and so the state needs to be created to protect those things in a similar way to Hobbes. Now on to what I consider to be the key figure here. We find the most influential 20th century formulation of social contract theory in the work of John Rawls. And why I consider this Rawls important is he's not always characterized in straightforward social contract terms. Sometimes you almost get a deontological sense from people promoting Rawls, and indeed there's elements of that, but at the end of the day, it is rational self-interest or selfishness that plays the pivotal role in his account. Rawls introduces the veil of ignorance to better clarify the nature of the laws to which self-interest binds us, or perhaps better stated, the veil better clarifies the meaning and extension of what we mean by rational self-interest. The veil forces each of us to choose the laws to which we bind ourselves via the social contract by blinding us to our actual place and standing in society. We do not know our sex, natural talents, economic situation, color, religion, etc. We only know that we desire to promote our own interest. Our self-interest mandates that we select two basic principles: the principle of equal liberty for all, basic rights for everybody compatible with those same rights for everyone else, and the difference principle that society can have some economic inequalities provided it benefits everyone. And we ought to live by these principles in our actual lives, since it is our rational self-interest that commits us to them in the first place. All right, the upshot of this social contract tradition, of which the U.S. Constitution, and to a lesser extent some European constitutions, are members, in terms of the foundation of social morality and associated moral motivation, is that each person's rational self-interest suffices ultimately both for a basic epistemic grasp of social moral principles and the motivation to conform to these principles. I contend that the trajectory of this account points away from long-term viability. In terms of both the U.S. and Europe, the success that social contract political justifications have enjoyed and continue to enjoy is in large part due to the influence of theistic and in particular Christian religions in the lives of the citizens. As our culture grows increasingly non-religious and at the same time self-interested, I contend that we are beginning to see the inadequacy of irrational self-interest as the key basis of moral motivation. In other words, the success that social contract theory has had, I think, is in some part accidental. I think it's because of these external influences of the Christian religion that have actually contributed to society's stability. And as we see that latter factor decrease, I expect trouble. Empirical evidence supports this claim. Rates of violent and sexual crimes increased dramatically over the last half century, with a bit of a decrease in the last 15 years. Moreover, and obviously Steubenville itself is probably a good representation of a snapshot into that as well, with the latest events. Moreover, cities and towns have decreased community bonds, evidenced, I maintain, by increased number of incidents such as the victims of misfortune or crime not being helped by their fellow citizens. And perhaps most importantly, in terms of the U.S., we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world, with over 1% of adults currently in jail. Now, I don't know what the rate is, I should have looked this up, of the rate of people who have at some time served prison time, but obviously it would be much higher. That's just people currently in jail. All right. Now, I do not mean to romanticize the past. I fully understand that there were violent crimes and egregious failures of moral motivation in centuries past and in decades past. Moreover, my argument does not depend on the empirical data, which as it stands indicates only a correlation between the decline of religion and loss of moral motivation. Because of this, I will give philosophical arguments that aim to show the deficiencies of rational self-interest as the basis of social morality, which, if successful, provides good reasons for contending the relation above is not just correlative, but actually a causal one. All right, so on to those arguments. I think the most general objection to self-interest as a sufficient moral motive pertains to the distinction between self-interest as such and rational self-interest. There is no problem with the conceptual distinction between the two. However, if the source of moral authority is thought to be only my own self-interest, I can override that authority by citing other self-interest considerations. To put this in terms of the question of motivation, there are a variety of reasons why the distinction would seem to evaporate or leave the agent in a position where his actual desire is inconsistent with what enlightened self-interest demands. Based on my experience with hundreds of students discussing this point, they respond to this problem with a great big so what. In other words, if all they have in front of them is their own rational self-interest, they will say, I'm not going to follow that. I don't care. I want to do this. In other words, it's not a strong enough motive to get them to do what they are supposed to do. Consider the following situation. Peter, and that's just a coincidence that I picked Peter there. Where is Peter? Sorry about that. Peter Colosi does desire the social stability and security that comes from the social contract. However, Peter realizes that he is in a position to take a large sum of money from Sealing Mart and in all probability to get away with it. His self-interest continues to desire that the rest of society uphold their end of the bargain and by doing so safeguard the social stability he wants. So if he can be reasonably sure that they will continue to act toward social stability, what reason does he have not to steal? The obligation that results from self-interest, even rational self-interest, seems too thin to affect his behavior here, at least in his own mind. Secondly, the dynamism between self-interest and moral motivation would seem to fade the older one gets. For the social contractarian, we engage in the practice of morality only because it is in our personal interest to do so. So, for instance, if the government were to collapse and send us back into the state of nature, all bets are off. Total freedom, uninhibited by moral consideration, wins the day. But even without such a governmental collapse, morality is tolerated, not relished or cherished. In a stable society, a young person may see that it is indeed in his long-term self-interest to promote the social order. But as he ages, if self-interest is his only moral motive, he will have less reason to participate in morality. Long-term goals are no longer achievable due to the inevitability of death, and not the most optimistic point, but there is another trend relevant to aging that I think saves us. One is more likely to become religious the older one gets, which will ultimately tie into my overall argument to be considered in the next section. Nonetheless, if we focus only on moral motivation based on self-interest alone, Aging adds one more dimension to the unsustainability of pure social contract theory. While I think an analogous argument could be made of any reckless young person who simply has no regard for future goals, due to the space considerations, I will move to the next objection, which is even if we continue to focus only on an external social morality and not on issues such as the role a substantive good of human nature might play beyond that external dimension, the structure of social contract theory seems to leave to the side important aspects of the moral domain, such as helping others or seeing oneself as integrally connected to the community. This, of course, is a common communitarian critique, but it is worth reiterating in the context of moral motivation. In terms of motivation, the problem could be summed up with the word minimal. In terms of self-interest, even the best of rational self-interest, a person is only motivated to do those things that fulfill the social contract and absolutely nothing more. Recall that morality is more or less a necessary evil. I might see that performing certain unattractive actions in no way promote my selfishness in the short term, but are necessary for my long-term interest. But if an act, such as helping a fellow subway passenger who is being victimized, is not necessitated by the contract, then I have no reason to perform it. If this motivational structure were the norm, it is difficult to imagine that a society could survive for more than a few generations. The bonds holding society would simply break apart. What objection might these arguments raise? The main argument might be that I am being unfair to social contract theory. Any of these arguments could be adapted as a case against any naturalistic ethical theory. In response, I am not sure that that is the case, but even if it was so, the prevalence of social contract justification of both governmental institutions and social morality in our society make it a fair particular target. Going back to the original response, it might depend on what one means by naturalistic. But if Kantianism, eudaimonism, and even non-egoistic versions of utilitarianism are not susceptible to the arguments above, it is because they have a more substantive conception of duty, objective well-being, or social utility that serves as the foundation of motives for everyday behavior. My core objection to social contract theory is that self-interest is not an adequate basis. So however you might shape it, self-interest is just too thin of a concept to ground long-term, morally upright behavior. That being said, I think any account of social morality has improved chances of practical success if God and religion constitutes a basis of why one should be moral. And this brings me to the last section of the paper, focusing on how God and by extension religion, or I really should say religion and by extension God, can offer motives sufficient for the promotion of the state. There are two ways that this last section could go. First, I could argue that we ought to reject any contractarian thinking for social morality and replace it with some other moral theory altogether. From a more ideal perspective, this option is attractive. However, if we wish to be practical and realistic, we should admit that social contract justification for morality has, at least for the time being in our society, has won the day. And therefore, if we have any chances of improving society, we should basically work within that framework if possible. It is going to be the second approach I use in the following arguments. So this goes back to my first point that, again, I don't want to just reject social contract theory. Given its stature, can we work within it to improve it from a theistic perspective? And I think these are some reasons why we should. To my first suggestion, which we could call the Pascalian defense, the possibilities of eternal reward and eternal suffering serve as excellent correctives to the shortcomings of earthbound self-interest discussed above. Mentioning each of those three arguments in turn, the line between self-interest and rational self-interest is much more clearly defined if you have an afterlife component. It is irrational to act upon raw self-interest in any circumstance that involves acting contrary to the law, because to do so in a theistic perspective would to risk eternal damnation. All right, so this changes the equation. It doesn't necessarily change the structure. I'm still acting for just pure self-interest, but it definitely adds moral weight to not breaking the law. With respect to the second issue of the decreased importance of following social morality the older one gets, The possibility of hell flips the dynamism on its head. The older one gets, the closer he gets to death, and therefore the greater motivation he has to follow moral precepts in a theistic context. Lastly, the prospects of heaven and hell reinforce the riskiness, if not pure folly, of moral minimalism. Eternal consequences cannot be taken so lightly. In sum, the afterlife, or the possibility of an afterlife, shores up all of the motive-based deficiencies of finite terrestrial self-interest that we just discussed in the second section. Social contract theory alone falls into another trap not discussed above. If self-interest is the sole basis of our acting, we cannot help but to treat every other person as a means to our own end. The more radical contractarian, such as Hobbes, contends each of us is determined by nature to be egoistic. Most others, however, either suspend judgment on the matter or claim that we are not so solely determined, that altruism is possible. Let us assume that Hobbes is wrong and we are, in fact, capable of altruism. Even with that assumption, naturalistic social contract theory encourages us to be egoistic by the consideration of rational self-interest alone. In other words, on social contract theory, we end up treating others and being treated by others as mere means and not by ends, not as ends, by the very nature of morality itself. Right? So if you have a pure social contract framework, and that's all that ethics is for you, and ethics is a matter of extending your own interest, you are necessitated then to treat other people as a mere means to your ends. And you're morally obligated to do so, right? Because what's moral obligation but the rational extension of your own interest, right? So that seems to be problematic. Religion provides a realistic remedy to this. By affirming the value and dignity of each person, we are more likely to aspire to treating others as we ourselves would like to be treated, namely as ends and not mere means. However, we can recognize from the perspective of religion that one net effect of original sin is that a segment of the population will always fail to do what is necessary, and the rest of us will frequently fail to do this. And here's where I think social contract theory does have a mark in its favor. Social contract thinking does, in these cases, provide a sort of social safety net to minimize the damages. I may not wish to treat another person with respect in a given instance, but my desire for the continued fulfillment of my desires saves me from doing anything too destructive. This sort of thinking keeps society minimally functional so that when I do choose to treat others as ends, and if I seek to act in a genuinely religious manner, I will choose to do so I can do so. In other words, let's maintain social contract theory as a baseline, that there's going to be people who are non-religious. So how do we convince them to work in a manner that's morally constructive for society as a whole? Well, that's what we use social contract thinking for. But we need to see that we should not view it exhaustively. That's a fail-safe, that's a safety net. But we should hope for a greater segment of the population to have these more deeper moral motives based in religion, both for the sake of everyday morality, but also with the goal of ultimately treating one another with the dignity and respect appropriate to being human persons. In conclusion, I have left to the side the question of whether God is necessary for the justification of morality, and instead focused on whether God and religion are necessary for adequate moral motivation, particularly in terms of social contract justification. I think that history has shown that some individuals are capable of acting in a minimally acceptable way without God and religion. However, there has not been a historical test of whether a wholly non-religious society can motivate itself sufficiently in the long run. We may have empirical results relevant to this question. We may have empirically relevant results to this question down the road, but at this point we can only speculate, and my argumentative speculation concludes that such a society would not survive. Thank you.